Greetings and welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. Yay! This month we're focusing on the theme of pursuing God. Now I want to tell you a story and I want to ask you a question. This is a story. There was a man who I will leave nameless, I won't tell you his name, but he was born in a little country town. Over the years, that town developed and it became a mighty city. But when this man was growing up, it was just a little backwoods town. It did not have electricity. It did not have running water. So when he felt he was grown, he moved to a big city up north, looking for work and also looking for a better life. But he always kept some contact with his family back home. His life took him into the best and the worst of places. There's some stories he will not even tell. But he went through jobs that paid him right and others that barely paid him at all, if they paid him at all. And he went through friends who were really friends and others who betrayed him in the worst of ways. He eventually found a way to open a successful restaurant only to have organized crime force him out of business. He went through prison. For armed robbery, he went through drug addiction on hard drugs, and he also at times weaved in and out of the artistic intellectual world and the world of the rich. It was like he lived 10 lives in one lifetime. In his 50s or 60s, he made one of his trips back home, but this time people saw something different in him. He was so different that the pastor asked him to teach the Sunday or preach the Sunday sermon. Now that man, he'd felt the tug of God on his life throughout his life. In fact, every place that he was. People didn't know that he was always talking to God, even in prison, even in the drug addiction. He never forgot or abandoned God. But now he was talking about God publicly, just in his everyday conversation. He said that he had been to many places in his life, but he'd never been in a pulpit. So he hesitantly and somewhat fearfully agreed to preach the Sunday sermon. Now that Sunday, the church was packed with curiosity seekers, supporters, those who wanted to watch him fail, and those who just wondered what in the world is going on in our church. He began with his notes, and then God dropped the anointing on him. He could no longer see his notes, but his mouth kept talking. He preached about God's faithfulness in the ups and downs of life. He told stories he had never told. He held nothing back. Throughout the sermon, he would repeat, "You never look down on a man or a woman unless you're reaching down to pull them up." He preached, and the whole church felt the Spirit of God as they never had before. They wanted him to come back next Sunday, but he said no. He said no. It wasn't that he could not, but he realized that God only wanted him to preach that one sermon. His years of talking with God in the best and the worst of places had trained him to know the voice and the will of God. He never preached another sermon, but even over 20 years later, people can still recite parts of that sermon. That man realized what many people still do not realize, and that is that God generally gives each one of us one sermon for life. Even preachers usually have only one sermon. For example, if you think of Reverend Billy Graham, his sermon was always, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life." John 3:16. He taught it in different ways, with different words, and in different places. But that was his sermon. He lived it, he preached it, he breathed it all his life. Now back to the man. It was not in the pulpit, but in the studying, the meditating, and even the struggling with God for a message for that Sunday sermon, where God opened the man's heart and brought him to his one sermon, his personal sermon. All his life, wherever he was, he realized that that's exactly what he had done. And it clicked in his head that through his life, with that sermon, he worshiped God and he pursued God. Now, our personal sermon, our life sermon, is a major vehicle or a major way that we work out our pursuit of God. That's how we pursue God, through that sermon that's in our heart. Your purpose comes out of that. Your worship comes out of that sermon. Your life and your abundant life comes out of that inner sermon, that sermon that's in your heart. God said it through Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, you will seek me and find me when you seek or pursue me with your whole heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. That sermon in your heart, I'm going to use it to pull you out of all the ups and downs of your life to the place where I want you to be. So my question to you is, what is your sermon? What is the message that God has placed in your heart? What guiding sermon takes you through the valleys and the mountaintops of life? What sermon has God placed in your heart? Now remember, you do not need to get into a pulpit to find your sermon. But what is your sermon? You know what it is. It's already in you, and it will use that to propel you to pursue God. So God bless you. Have a blessed week. See you next Wednesday, next Wisdom Wednesday.